Welcome back to Face the Nation. We want to go now to someone who has become a weekly guest on this broadcast, former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He's in Westport, Connecticut. Good morning.
Good morning.
Dr. Gottlieb, I want to start with just your basic assessment. What is happening right now with this pandemic?
Well, these are major epidemics that are underway in the South and the Southeast right now. You look at Texas with almost 6,000 cases, California almost 6,000 cases, Georgia's getting hot with 2,000 cases, Florida with almost 10,000 cases right now, and Texas with about 5,500 people hospitalized. This is community spread that's been underway for some time. It's going to be hard to extinguish. We're going to have many weeks ahead of us of continued growth in these cases, at least 2 or 3 weeks, even if we take aggressive actions right now, which across the board we're not doing. And I know a lot of the discussion right now is that these cases are clustered in younger people, so deaths are actually coming down, but that's not likely to stay that way. This spread is likely to seep into more vulnerable communities, and we're likely to see total daily deaths start to go back up again.
So your point is this can't be changed or turned off with a switch, that while we're seeing big numbers, we should expect them for a while and more bad news.
Well, look at New York. New York implemented the stay-at-home order on March 20th. It was a Friday. It went into effect on Sunday. They peaked in terms of the number of daily cases that they were reporting on April 7th. So almost 3 weeks after they implemented a stay-at-home order, the cases continued to build, and then they started to slowly decline. We're implementing measures in these states. The governors have taken action, but the action is much weaker than a stay-at-home order. And so even if it does have some impact on the continued spread, it's going to be a marginal impact, and it's going to take more time to flow through. So I think that these states have some difficult weeks ahead. And you look at states like Florida, which might be in the worst shape right now. It looks like they may be tipping over into exponential growth. And so they're going to see perhaps rapid acceleration in a number of cases. So it's a difficult situation right now. I think over the next week, we're going to know just how pervasive the spread is, but it looks pretty widespread right now.
In your judgment, was the rush to reopen too fast?
Well, I think two things happened. One, we reopened against the backdrop of a lot of spread, and so it was only going to go in one direction. There was already a lot of infection around to continue building new cases, and these epidemics take time to build. And the other thing was the speed of the opening in some of these states. They didn't really pause in between steps of their reopening for a sufficient amount of time to see if it was having an untoward effect. And so as they reopened parts of their economies, they should have taken 2-week pauses in between. That's what states like Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Michigan did, and did it successfully so that they could measure the impact of their actions.
What do you make, Dr. Gottlieb, about the European Union's choice or decision not to allow U.S. travelers because the outbreak has not been sufficiently contained in America?
Well, look, I think there was some inevitability to that. We still have a lot of spread across this country. If you think that we're only diagnosing 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 cases, the CDC said about 1 in 10 cases are being diagnosed. I think it's probably a little bit better than that. But you look at the 40,000 infections that we have, and it really probably represents 250,000 infections on a daily basis. That's a lot of infection around the United States. And so for countries that really crushed their epidemics, I think there was an inevitability that they were going to limit travel from U.S. travelers into those countries. I think the other thing that we're going to see probably start to materialize on a wider scale are restrictions within the United States. I think states that have crushed their epidemic are going to start to put up more stringent restrictions on travel. You already saw the beginning of that with New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York coming together, but there's a lot more that states can do, including screenings at airports for passengers flowing through certain parts of the country that might limit travel within the United States.
You mentioned that you don't think closing bars and some of the limited pause measures that some of these states that have reopened have put in place now that we're seeing these spikes. What would be effective that could be implemented?
Well, the easiest thing we could do is universal masking, and I don't understand why we can't mandate it in states that have major epidemics underway, and there's a number that do right now. We mandate that people have to wear seatbelts in cars, but we're not saying that they have to wear a mask in the setting of an epidemic. If a large percentage of the population, not everyone, but a large percentage of the population wore masks on a regular basis, reasonable quality masks, that alone could reverse the epidemic, could get the transfer rate, the R, if you will, below 1. So it's the simplest intervention that we can take that could have an impact on the spread right now.
In terms of getting people to wear masks, what have we learned or not learned about the way in which we all do or don't collectively take action to do the things that are necessary to slow the spread and beat back this thing?
Well, look, we have a hard 6 months ahead of us. We're going to get through this. This is a brief moment in our long history. We need to focus on preserving life, and we need to focus on maintaining the things that are most important to us, keeping our businesses open, sending our children back to school in the fall, preserving the healthcare system, protecting the vulnerable. And so we all collectively need to come together to do what we can to limit spread. And that means reducing some of our daily interactions, wearing masks, being more vigilant. After about 6-7 months, we're going to get to a therapeutic or a vaccine that's going to help us more fully vanquish this COVID threat. But it's really an early 2021 event. So we need to just get through 2020. I think we need to come together and think about what we can do as a nation to reduce our collective risk and not make this so cantankerous. The idea of universal masking, wearing a mask when you go out. There's a lot of things we do that are inconveniences, but we do it to protect ourselves and protect our fellow citizens.
All right, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, thanks again for being with us, and we'll be right back. As nationwide calls for racial justice and police reform continued this week, legislation in Washington reached a stalemate. A Republican-backed police reform bill was blocked by Senate Democrats. And while House Democrats did pass a bill, the legislation is likely dead on arrival in the Senate. We want to return now to our conversation with Vice President Pence. What do you hear the protesters saying when they protest?
Well, it's been a focus of ours since the tragic killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. There's no excuse for what happened to George Floyd, but there's also no excuse for the rioting and looting and violence that ensued. Look, the president engaged law enforcement leaders. We've sat down with leaders in the African-American community. I've met with leaders in the African-American community and law enforcement in cities around this country. And what I hear is while the radical left says we need to defund the police, what the American people want is for us to fund the police with additional training and support, and also improve the lives of the people in our African-American community, which I'm proud to say, under President Trump's leadership, we were doing over the last 3 years. We don't need to choose between supporting law enforcement and supporting our African-American neighbors. We can do both, and that's how we bring our country together.
One thing protesters would like to hear is leaders say Black Lives Matter. You won't say that. Why?
All my life, I've been inspired by the example of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. When I was in Congress, I traveled to his home church in Montgomery. With Congressman John Lewis, I walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the anniversary of Bloody Sunday. I cherish the progress that we have made toward a more perfect union for African Americans throughout our history. And I've aspired throughout my career to be a part of that ongoing work. It's really a hard issue for me. And as a pro-life American, I also believe that all life matters, born and unborn. But what I see in the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement is a political agenda of the radical left that would defund the police, that would
leave that out of it, just
tear
the
down
phrase.
Monuments, that would press a radical left agenda that and support calls for the kind of violence that has beset the very communities that they say that they're advocating for. I've literally met with African American leaders around this country and in the national capital area who made it clear to us they want law and order, they want peace in our streets.
So you won't say Black Lives Matter?
John, I really believe that all lives matter.
Okay.
And that's where the heart of the American people lies.
And now we turn to the senator who drafted the Senate bill on police reform, South Carolina Republican Senator Tim Scott. Good morning. Good to see you, Senator.
Good morning, John. I hope you're doing well.
We're doing all right. I want to ask you about this national moment that's testing all of us. Protests in the street like we haven't seen since the 1960s. I'd like to ask you what I asked the Vice President. What do you hear in the voices of those protesters?
Well, I hear from the nonviolent protesters, what we hear consistently is this frustration that was ignited by 8 minutes and 46 seconds of George Floyd pleading for his life, saying he could not breathe, and then at the end, asking for his mother. What I hear is a concern and a frustration that I have felt as a person who's been stopped by law enforcement 18 times in the last couple decades, including this year. What I hear in the protesters is enough already, let's get to the table and get something done. And what I hear from the protesters is this is our country. We want our voices to be heard in this country. And what I did, because I heard and have felt the frustration of the protesters myself, is I drafted legislation that said, we see you, we hear you, and let's move together forward. This is a very interesting and important moment. Interesting in that the country's response, John, has been amazing. White folks and black folks, brown ones and yellow ones, have come together in the streets of our cities to say, we want to be a unified country. I say thank you and God bless them.
In the moment of unity, Senator, I don't want to ask you this next question, but I must. The President of the United States promoted to his 82 million Twitter followers today a video in which somebody screamed white power. I'm going to play that now for those who've not seen it. Senator, that's on the President of the United States Twitter feed to 82 million people. Your reaction?
Well, he should just take it down. There's nothing much to be said. That is inappropriate, and it should be taken down.
But you were talking about unity. You just made a very compelling case just then.
Absolutely.
About hearing this agony and this cry of protesters and coming together for unity. White power is not unity.
Well, no, it absolutely is not. I mean, I live in a city where the Civil War started, and I'm so thankful that the people of South Carolina, specifically in Charleston, we have evolved as a people, and that is a great thing. And the truth of the matter is, when you hear things like that racist chant towards white power, we should have the same response with the same type of energy that we have for those folks we know have been disadvantaged for so long. We should stand up and say, that's not right. And I'm saying the exact same thing now. That's not right. But that's not the entire conversation, and that's not the entire clip. That was a terrible display that I saw in that video. I watched the whole video before I came on the show. The whole thing was terrible.
Yeah. Let's get to your legislation, because that's your effort to try to get at this moment we're on. Why did the bill break down in the Senate?
Well, John, it's hard for me to tell you exactly why. My suspicion is that the presidential politics and choosing a vice president was a part of that conversation. What I offered my friends on the other side was not 5 amendments based on Senator Schumer's letter to us saying that there were 5 major issues. I said, let's fix those 5. They came into a room and we were going to chat about it. They said, there's 20 things that we'd like to change. I said, I'll give you 20 amendments, and I'll start by offering the First Amendment myself on chokeholds. Our legislations were about the same, except for in the House legislation, they had blood flow as well as airflow. They suggested that my legislation did not include blood flow. I will add the carotid in there, and we'll make that change. We could do so much together for those folks in the streets today. We missed a golden opportunity, not because the bills weren't similar enough, but because what the House wanted was not what the Senate Democrats wanted to have a conversation about.
So it seems to me, Senator, there's both a procedural question and then there's a policy question in your disagreement with Democrats. But I want to get at, you suggested this is about vice presidential politics. Do you think Democrats are talking to you in good faith as you try to revive what might happen in the Senate, or is it past that?
Well, listen, I'm going to be open to having a conversation this week in a few days with some of the leaders who put together the House bill. I fashioned much of what I saw from what I liked in the House bill. There are things in the House bill that I do think are not in the best interest of the country. Let me just be clear on that fact. While I do talk about the fact that there are a lot of things in common, there are a few things that I believe makes it worse on cities, makes it worse on the most vulnerable populations within those cities. And what we're seeing manifesting in New York City today is a byproduct of those concerns that I have about the House legislation. There's a reason why murder is up 79% over the numbers last year, 64% shooting increase over the numbers last year, just in New York City. When you start demonizing and stereotyping all law enforcement as evil and bad, you start putting targets on their backs, you start seeing them withdraw from some areas, and that creates a powder keg that's not good for the nation. And so the demonizing of law enforcement is not a part of my bill because I don't want law enforcement to demonize African Americans. We have to be on the same page.
So quickly, Senator, on the question, though, of accountability and holding police accountable, with this question of qualified immunity, basically the other side is saying they get let off the hook unless they do something that's excessively egregious. Is there any way to fix that or come to common ground on that?
I think there's a way for us to do so by doing two things. You have to bifurcate the issue. Number one, law enforcement officers being civilly, not prosecuted, but to get exact money from law enforcement officers as a means of fixing this problem. I don't agree with that at all. Giving the victims' families an opportunity to get more money from cities and counties and states, absolutely.
Okay, Senator Scott, we're very grateful you're with us. We've run out of time. Thanks so much.
Oh, darn. Thank you, John.
We'll be back in a moment. Joining us now is Sherrilyn Ifill, the president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, an organization dedicated to fighting for racial justice. She joins us this morning from Baltimore. Good morning.
Good morning, John.
I want to start with that video that we just played for Senator Scott. Apparently, the president has now taken it down, but when you're president, you can't delete the things you say. And I wanted to get your reaction about the white power video that he promoted.
This is really not about the president taking it down. This is about the judgment of the president in putting it up. It's about what the president believes, and it's time for this country to really face that. I spent the first few years of this presidency with reporters asking me questions over and over again about whether, in fact, the president was racist and whether he supported white supremacist ideologies. I'm through answering that question because the president answers it himself, and he did this morning.
In talking to the vice president, I asked him about the phrase Black Lives Matter, and he said all lives matter. I wonder, in the current context, that in this moment of protests like we haven't seen since the 1960s, what you think he misses about that phrase and what it means in this moment?
I think that we don't have enough time on this program to actually explore all the things the vice president is likely missing. You know, even if the vice president had said Black Lives Matter, it would be hollow, and I wouldn't believe it, because he is the vice president of the United States, just like we have a president, just like we have senators, and they should be judged by their actions and what they do. And, you know, when I hear the vice president say that for his entire life he has been guided by the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., then he would know what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said about protests in 1965 and 66 that protested police violence in African American communities when he said riots are the language of the unheard. So to hear him say that and then at the same time hear his comments about protests demonstrate that the vice president is far from understanding the significance of this moment and really what his obligation is when people across the country in 50 states, not just black people, but people of all races are coming together and standing together and saying enough is enough.
So one of the responses to that cry from the streets is the bills that have gone through the House and the Senate. Focusing on the Senate for a moment, we just talked to Senator Scott, whose bill was blocked. Part of what the Democratic senators did was cite your work in why that bill should be blocked. Was it irredeemable, that legislation, or is there any common ground here to get maybe some movement on this issue?
You know, much is told by the senator's words that this is a response to the cries from the street in light of the death of George Floyd. That is not where this started. And the problem is that too many people in the United States Congress have only woken up to this issue or decided to do something about this issue in the last 6 weeks or the last 4 weeks. Where were they in 2014 when people were protesting in Ferguson? Where were they in 2014 when Eric Garner was choked to death on the streets of New York? And that's just, in 2014. Some of us can go back to Eleanor Bumpurs and Michael Stewart and Clifford Glover. This is a decades-long struggle. The protests of the 1960s in 64, 65, 66, 67 in cities all over this country, 150 cities, almost all of those protests, all of those incidents of unrest began with an encounter between law enforcement and African Americans and African American communities. So we've had a lot of time to think about what is needed, and what is needed is a regime of accountability. And the problem with the Senate bill is that it does not propose a regime of accountability. It proposes a regime of data collection and the creation of commissions to study a problem that we already know quite a bit about. So what we need is accountability, and that is completely absent from the Senate bill. The House bill does include a regime of accountability. And I will say I don't represent the Democratic Party. I represent communities of color. I represent Black people as a civil rights organization, as leader of a civil rights organization, and we didn't get everything we wanted in the House bill either. But the House bill does include a strong regime of accountability. It addresses the issue of qualified immunity, for example, which you were discussing with Senator Scott.
Walk me through qualified immunity, because there's some ways in which qualified immunity is very helpful for federal workers trying to do their jobs. Explain the problem in terms of accountability, and whether is there any middle ground here that can be found?
Well, first of all, this bill only would eliminate qualified immunity for law enforcement officers, so it would be limited to that category. Secondly, qualified immunity has been so distorted. The doctrine basically is a defense that allows public workers and police officers in this case to be able to defend themselves against actions they may have taken unless it was clear that those actions violated the law. In other words, there has to be a clearly established law that the actions were unconstitutional. But courts have now taken it to the point where unless the exact fact pattern, so a police officer, tases to death our client in Phoenix City, Alabama, and we can't get the Supreme Court to hear the case because there has to be an exact scenario of someone being tased to death 19 times that has been found to be unconstitutional in order to establish that qualified immunity is not available. It is beyond belief the kinds of cases, the kinds of egregious conduct that we see, and the way in which it's been distorted. Conservatives, many conservatives, also understand that qualified immunity has gone too far, including Senator Lindsey Graham, who said he's willing to look at it. So we need to deal with that element of accountability.
All right, Sherrilyn Ifill, we're going to have to end it there. We've run out of time. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, John.
And we'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Margaret will be back next week. For Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.